Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm happy to finally be able to stand and take a call on the third reading of the unit titles bill. This piece of legislation has been sitting on the order paper for a while, and I think we're all very, very pleased to finally see it pass into law. I wouldn't say we're pleased to finally see the back of it, because that wouldn't be true. It was very interesting. Certainly when we have members of the public coming into our offices now with unit title questions, members of the Social Services Select Committee are more than well equipped to deal with those issues now. In fact, if anyone needs any help, I suggest that they forward them to Katrina Shanks, Chair of the Social Services Select Committee. She's available day and night to help members of the public with their queries on unit title legislation. Mr Chair, I want to thank the Minister who just took his seat. And I want to thank him for his wonderful 2 weeks as Acting Minister of Housing. 5 weeks. Oh, it went so fast. It went so fast. It went by in a blur. We had a wonderful time facing off against each other for that short period of time, and he will be sadly missed. But he does remain in the portfolio of building and housing, which of course has crossover to this legislation. Mr Speaker, I want to thank the members of the Social Services Select Committee, the officials and all the submitters on this very technical but extremely important piece of legislation. I think everyone in this House recognises that the Unit Titles Act 1972 is highly outdated, it's archaic, and it certainly is not flexible enough or modern enough to deal with the range of unit title developments that exist in New Zealand today. Mr Speaker, I want to just touch on a couple of the important changes that this Act makes. The first is around ownership and utility interests. Mr Speaker, the ownership interest is the interest that's assigned by a registered valuer to the principal and the accessory units in a unit title development, and the utility interest is also assigned to the principal and accessory units. But in this particular area of interest, the body corporate is able to vote to change the calculation around who pays what and in what proportion, so that they can get a more fair and reasonable apportionment of the costs. And this is very important. And I want to thank my colleague Chris Hipkins for raising this issue with me. He had a constituent come and see him about the existing unit titles law with strong concerns about the inability under the existing law to make sure that those apportionments are fair and reasonable. And so we went back to when we were working at Select Committee and made sure that those concerns raised by Mr Chris Hipkins' constituents were addressed, and I'm very, very pleased to say that they are under this legislation. Under this legislation, body corporate will be able to far more flexibly and fairly apportion those costs, which is not to say that there was unanimous agreement amongst submitters. Under the law, which is about the legislation which is about to pass into law, both those interests, the ownership interest and the utility interest, can be reassessed at any time as long as 3 years has passed since the last assessment. Some submitters thought that was too long, some submitters thought that too short. I think it provides a very good balance between not putting too much of a burden on the body corporate to be constantly reassessing those interests, but also making sure that they're kept up to date. And this comes down to issues as simple, Mr Speaker, as who should pay for a lift in a multi-storey development. Should the people on the ground floor who get no benefit from that have to pay the same amount for maintenance as people who use it regularly? Sounds like a simple issue, but this is the kind of thing that can bog body corporates down, and it's important that the law is clear that it is up to that body corporate to be able to apportion those interests fairly. Now, one of the other things I want to mention is what this bill does around the establishment and constitution of bodies corporate. And under this legislation, a body corporate is automatically created once a unit plan is deposited. And from that point, Mr Speaker, the body corporate is responsible for that range of maintenance functions for the upkeep of the property and of the whole development. Now, we had some submitters come along who quite fairly said, well, we're a really tiny development. Why should we have to go through all the rigmaroles of one of these big body corporate developments when we're only talking about a few units? And we did consider that as a select committee. We decided that given that people know when they go into purchasing one of these units that it will be a unit title development under unit title law that will require the formation of a body corporate, we felt that that was probably fair enough. It is also important to say that at a later point, a body corporate can decide to cancel its unit plan, to subdivide its land, to subdivide its buildings, and to take up some other alternative structure if that is the will of the body corporate. But it's important to point out that one of the most important things about this law change is it will reduce the costs on body corporates. So the concerns that small body corporates have about having to shoulder all those costs will be far reduced under this piece of legislation. And not only that, but the bill does allow for developments of 9 or fewer units. They are not required to form a committee if they do not wish to do so, and they may opt out of auditing requirements. So we have recognised that the situation for those smaller developments is different compared to the bigger ones, and we have made some relief in that respect, Mr. Speaker. Now, I want to move on to an important part, which is about the rights and responsibilities of unit holders. This is where we've seen quite a lot of litigation over the years, particularly around leaky buildings, and it was important that we do get this absolutely right. We need to be clear about exactly when a body corporate is responsible and when an individual unit holder is responsible. And what this piece of legislation says that in general, where that property is common property, then it is a responsibility of the body corporate to recover the money expended for repairs, except in a situation where a unit holder has caused the damage to the property by his or her actions, and in that case the unit holder will be held responsible. Now, this isn't clear in the existing law which is about to be replaced. And I want to make this very clear because this is an area where there has been significant litigation around leaking homes. This bill will impose an obligation on body corporates to maintain, repair or renew all building elements and all infrastructure that relate to or serve more than one unit. This is clause 122 of the legislation. This is a common sense resolution of the matter, and that has been subject to considerable litigation, as members will be aware. Where there is a leaky building issue with the exterior of an apartment complex, this may manifest in a manner that does only affect 1 or 2 apartments, and it may be tempting to say that only those people are responsible for the repairs. However, what we know is that the reality is, unless that is remedied, it will invariably affect the entire complex and the entire unit title development. And much of the litigation that has occurred, Mr. Speaker, in this area has focused on whether the body corporate should be allowed to contribute to the costs of rectifying these issues, and there is competing precedent in this area where the High Court has taken 2 different views in the cases of Young and Sunset Terraces as to whether or not body corporates are able to do that. I think it's important that this House make it quite clear that in this piece of legislation we have taken the approach of the Young High Court case, which shifts, and this will shift the focus to rectifying the problem as quickly as possible. And I think that's very important to point out, Mr. Speaker, where there is conflicting precedent, where the High Court may look to this House to clarify what was the intention of Parliament. It was the intention of Parliament to follow the example of Young and the decision of Young in the High Court, and that was the role, that was the way that the Select Committee went, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has already mentioned long-term maintenance plans. This is a significant change in the law, and it is important because we've seen in the past where there's been the need for significant capital developments in a unit title development, those unit title holders can be hit with a very, very large one-off cost, and that has resulted, particularly because under the existing law, any one person could object to that work being done, that where a person was in a position where they would find it difficult to pay for that significant one-off cost, they would vote against it and then block that work being carried out, not because the work didn't need to be carried out, but because they simply couldn't afford to pay that large one-off cost. So when this piece of legislation was introduced, it had a requirement for a long-term maintenance plan to be developed and a requirement for a fund to be put in place to pay for that long-term maintenance plan. Now, we had submitters come to Select Committee saying that they didn't feel that it was necessary to legislate that in law. We looked at 3 options. One was the status quo under the Unit Titles Bill. The second was saying that the long-term maintenance plan had to be mandatory, but the fund could be opted out of by a special resolution of the body corporate. And the third was to say that both the plan and the fund were mandatory, but both could be opted out of by special resolution of the body corporate. The Select Committee weighed up the options and felt we should go down the path of saying that the long-term maintenance plan is mandatory, that cannot be opted out of, but the way in which it is paid for can be flexible. So under the legislation, the fund is mandatory, but by special resolution of the body corporate, that can be opted out of. And I think that provides the flexibility that is needed under this Act. Mr Speaker, there have been a number of changes regarding disputes resolution, opening up the tenancy tribunal to the unit titles, making the district court instead of the High Court the court of first appeal. All these things will make it cheaper for unit title holders, will make it far more simple, and